All right, so my task is soybean soil fertility, and as you've seen already, we have more than me that work on soybean soil fertility in NDSU, and that's a really good thing because we're a big state. And there's a lot of acres of soybeans, and there's a lot of questions, and there's more than one person can handle. So, what am I going to touch on today? I want to touch on what already came up as a question on supplemental N. Whether to inoculate or not, which Greg Endres has already touched on very well. And then the phosphate, banding, other nutrients, foliar nutrient supplements, and then micronutrients. So let's head it off. So as soybean, which I think a lot of you understand came out of China and developed in association with bacteria, nitrogen fixing bacteria, symbiotic nitrogen fixing bacteria. The main one that we focused on for many years has been the Bradyrhizobium japonicum. There's others that have come on in the last couple of years that look like they're very promising, but the amount of field trials across there have been kind of low. So whether you jump on board with that or not is completely up to you. There's a lot of trials in the US and several lately in north central and northwest North Dakota that show that supplemental nitrogen does not increase soybean yield when nodules are functional. I think many of you have also grown dry beans in the past, and you know that we have a nitrogen recommendation for dry beans, and you kind of scratch your head and why isn't this happening with soybeans? And I think it's just the difference in where they develop. The dry beans developed in the same state in Mexico that corn was developed from, the teosinte. My guess is that 4,000 years ago it was an incredibly fertile area, and so the need genetically for dry bean to form some kind of association with their rhizobium was probably very low. Whereas in China, the need for the rhizobium was there, and the two developed together. So for whatever reason, soybean doesn't respond to nitrogen, and dry beans do, but they're completely different crops, even though they're in the same plant family. As Greg mentioned, there's a real need to inoculate in virgin soybean ground. There, with the price to this year, and with the number of acres we have in the state and the number of farmers that are looking at it, my guess is that there'll be some new acres that will have soybeans in them this coming year. And if you do, then inoculation is extremely important. And this is some data from Shana Forstugers now at Minot now as a director. And as Greg was saying, the double inoculation is really, I think, important because it's hard to mess up two. It's easy to mess up one, and you don't want to mess up one because nitrogen is so incredibly expensive. So let the rhizobia do their job, double inoculate. And so this is where we absolutely recommend that you inoculate your soybean. But if you had soybean within the last four years or so, this is some data I think from Carrington with the difference in cells per gram of soil. It's unlikely that you're going to see a response from inoculation, and the data shows that that's correct. So all right, so inoculation is not necessary or helpful. The field's been successfully nodulated soybean within the last 4 years. And also supplemental nitrogen is not helpful unless the nodulation is a total disaster and the leaf tissue indicates a nitrogen deficiency. I know some work from Greg and his colleagues at Carrington that show on the bottom here. Let's see, got the little laser pointer. Yay. Okay, so the untreated check was only 22 bushels without any supplemental nitrogen and no nodulation, and it needed to put on about 100 pounds of nitrogen so to get up to where you are. Of course, in today's environment where nitrogen is $1 a pound, maybe the extra $50 an acre isn't worth the worth the 3 bushel of beans. I'll leave that up to you, but at least some nitrogen needs to be applied because there's not enough coming from the soil. As Greg indicated, our critical value for fertilizing or not fertilizing soybeans have changed based on all the work that's been done in North Dakota in the past decade or so. As we visited around the table in Carrington in July of that year before we redid the circular, it was really surprising how many of us had done phosphate research and had not shown any yield response to phosphate. This is very unlike what you see in Iowa and Minnesota, and I can't explain it. The Minnesota work wasn't done just east of the Red River. It was almost all done in southeast Minnesota. So it's not like our neighbors are seeing it right across the river and we're not. It's different. So, so we established the new critical value of 7 ppm, and I think the old one was somewhere around 12. And I also think that with the phosphate price as high as it is, even though the soybean prices that you get per bushel is higher than it was last year, it's not the same magnitude as the phosphate price has increased. So if I was farming, I was putting in soybeans this year, I don't think I'd get too excited about putting on phosphate unless it was 6 part per million or less. Broadcast or banned seed separated phosphate is best. The seed place phosphate in all of the trials, and Carrington's done quite a few of them, have not shown a yield increase from doing any banding with the seed, and very oftentimes there's a yield decrease from doing it, and so it just doesn't make sense to put any seed place phosphate on. The reason we're putting on fertilizer is to increase yield, not to decrease it, and soybeans are just too sensitive, and some of these trials were in pretty moist years and it didn't matter. So here's the table that is shown in the soybean fertility trials, where we have 50 pounds of 1152 when we have a low soil test between 4 and 7 ppm in the Olson test, and then 100 pounds in the 0 to 3, and these are again in broadcast modes, and we don't want phosphate with the seed. And my little note down the bottom with P prices as high as they are, critical value of 6 is probably a better number. So across the river in Minnesota, some broadcast versus 2x2 band trials. The broadcast usually wins. It's not always the case. I know that Greg Carrington has done some work with broadcast and 2x2, and sometimes they're the same, and so some kind of a separation is okay. But broadcast, certainly, if you're putting on 100 pounds of MAP, it's easier to do that logistically than it is to try to shoot that through a 2x2. This is the problem with the fertilizer with the seed, and these formulations were what we call low salt formulations. They're not you shouldn't think that this is just a salt effect, because the low salts, of course, don't have a salt, but all of them either have a salt effect if they're 1034O based, or they have a urea component if they're low salt fertilizers. And either one of them, when we go to here's the check yield of 33 bushels roughly, and if we have a 2x2, 4 gallon an acre of the material, and we have the same yield, but then we go to an end furrow and we're dropping down about 8 bushels an acre. And if we go to higher rates than that, then of course we drop it down even further. And a lot of that has to do with stand loss. It probably has to do with plant vigor also. But look at the stand losses we're getting when we start putting fertilizer in with the seed. So don't do that. Don't do that. There's no advantage to the low salt starters. That study you just saw included low salt fertilizers, and they behave just the same as 1034O. So there's really no safety in it, because they have the urea component, which is at least as as harmful to the germinating seed as what salts are. So essentially to the soybean seed, they're the same. So moving on to other nutrients, our potassium rates are based on our clay maps. We developed those clay maps in response to what we were seeing in corn in dry summers, which are usually the kind of summers we have. That even with the old critical values, we were getting potassium deficiency symptoms, and we've seen some potassium deficiency symptoms on those kind of soils in soybeans also, although they're not quite as common. So this is the map. We use smectite iolite ratios, and there's not enough time to give a lesson in clay chemistry, but these exist. I have a circular on explaining the clay types and what they mean, and so you can get that on my website. Just search for Dave Franzen, NDSU, go down to my extension publications. There's one on clay chemistry and what it means to tillage, and what it means to nutrition. So this map will pop up. This is the dark areas are smectite is 3.5 to 1 iolite, and white areas are less than that. And that's kind of it's the threshold where we have to go to a higher value. And so we have those on our current recommendations. So we have a lot of you, especially out west, are going to be in this very high to high range and over 200 ppm, and so you don't have to worry about it at all. Those of you that are in the transitional range only have to worry about it if your smectite iolite ratio is greater than 3.5. And so the figures you see here on the right are the higher smectite iolite ratios, and the ones on the left are the ones where iolite are more dominant. So that's where it's based on. And we don't recommend any rates higher than 150 pounds of 0060. The next nutrient that I want to cover is the sulfur. Soybean is a lot more forgiving with lower sulfur values than what corn and small grains are. My colleague, who's retired now for the Iowa State, did quite a number of corn sulfur studies since 2005 when they first started showing quite a bit common sulfur deficiencies in the state. And so after a couple of years, he put out soybean trials in the same field or in the same neighborhood as what the corn trials were, and he very, very seldom saw sulfur deficiency. So I think generally that we probably won't see much of a response to sulfur, except if you're on sandy soils with lower water tables. And anywhere where you're in a soil that has a fairly high water table, like west of Colfax, for example, that water table is so close to the surface that you're getting high sulfate water into that root zone all the time. And so I can't imagine that you get much of a sulfur response there. If you do have a sulfur response, there's plenty of time to rescue soybean, because soybean is an August crop. And you know that if you don't get rain in August, you suffer. And if you get rain in August, like we did this last year, in a great part of the state, then their soybean yields are surprisingly good. So soybean can be a little bit beat up early in the season. And so if you see some areas and you confirm it with plant analysis, doing paired soil testing from areas that look good, areas that don't look good, you can certainly rescue it, and your yields are going to be fine. Or sulfur, compared to anything else, it's fairly cheap, and so you could just use it. But again, it's not very common to see sulfur deficiencies in soybean, even in years where we see quite a bit of problems in corn and small grains. So this next one is something that happens a lot, that there are quite a few farmers that are talked into doing the foliar application of some nutrients because the nodules aren't feeding the plant quite as much, and so you need to supplement it. And there's all kinds of reasons, for people thinking that this is a really good idea. But there's almost never an effective dollar payback, let alone profit, Most of the time, you're going to lose money doing this. The latest ones that I've been involved with was with Chris Augustine's PhD work. Chris, now the director down at Dickinson, he had two foliar treatments at each site in north central and northwest North Dakota for 6 site years, and you didn't see any effect in yield at 2 different timings in a series of years. And then recently there was a review. Hans Condell participated in this and had some data to share within the article. But a recent review of foliar studies in 16 US states over the 2019 and 2020 growing seasons for 46 site years found that foliar fertilizer didn't increase soybean yield, and profitability was reduced when using the products in the studies. And this is a direct quote from near the end of the article. Foliar fertilizer products tested in the study and similar products should not be recommended to U.S. soybean farmers in the absence of visual symptoms of nutrient deficiency. So I don't know how to get any more clear than that. It's just almost always a waste of money. So there's plenty of other places to spend money on. So in our studies across the state over the years, we found no need for any micronutrient supplements in North Dakota except for iron. So I think those of you in the eastern half of the state have seen this from some time to time. The farther west you go, the fewer times you've seen this, but certainly in the Red River Valley, even last year, as dry as it was, the wicking moisture that came up from underneath produced fields that had a fair amount of chlorosis. It was really pretty amazing. I didn't expect to see any at all, but you know, I'm always surprised about something. So we never see it until the first trifoliate. At that stage, the iron becomes immobile in the plant, whereas before it got its iron from the seed and it was fine, but now it isn't, and so it needs supplemental iron if it looks like this, or management needs to change in order to reduce the amount of the yellowing that you see. So these are strategies for iron deficiency chlorosis, or IDC reduction. And then the first is field selection, and I can't stress this enough, that putting the soybean on a field that's just totally unadapted to it is just it's just going to be a disaster. I could predict it right away. And the second thing is just as important as the variety selection, IDC tolerance under North Dakota and Northwest Minnesota conditions. And it's found in the North Dakota soybean variety trials. Hans Condell does a really nice job of compiling these variety trials every year. And they have an IDC score, and that's from our area. If you get your IDC scores for Iowa or any other state, and they transfer them up here, they have no idea the kind of stresses that you try to grow soybeans are. And so that's going to be a disaster too, for the most part. So once you've done a good job with field selection and then variety selection, then the next thing is some other management options that you might have. The bottom one there may be wider rows if the weed spectrum allows. You know, that we have so many weeds in our state, that's probably not going to be very practical. But if for some reason you have some areas that have an IDC problem and you've got the weeds under control, you can go to a little bit wider row, and that closer spacing of your soybeans will help out. If you're just have weeds and you can't do that, maybe increasing your seeding rate a little bit to get your seeds closer together, because I suppose that for whatever reason, the higher spacing within a row helps to reduce the IDC that you see. And then there might be an opportunity for companion crop, especially if you have higher nitrate values, as Greg was talking about, and Hans was talking about, and then the right iron fertilizer. Not all iron fertilizers are the same. So field selections, you're only going to get IDC if you have pH above 7. So if you have some soils that have pH below 7, but hopefully above 5.6 or so, those won't have IDC at all. I don't really talk about it here too much, but those of you in the West that have areas of of the field that have pHs 5, 4.9, 4.8, 4.7, 3.9. I've seen a 3.9 that Ryan Beto had out there. Those aren't going to grow soybeans very well at all. So that would be something to avoid. But in the rest of the state, in areas that have pHs over 7, you're likely to get IDC if the conditions are correct and if you choose a bad variety. So select fields with the electrical conductivity, which is the salts or level of salts no higher than 1.5, and then select fields with decent drainage because that'll help too. So that's field selection. So you saw the graph that Hans had about the yields that you were getting at Oaks irrigated. Of course, part of that high yield is due to just measured water throughout the season, and that's certainly true. But the other is I've been out and worked on the Oaks irrigation fields before, and it's unusual really to see ECs above 0.1, certainly not above 0.2, and so there's really not a whole lot of interaction with salts, but salts are really a killer for soybeans. You see with, this is a North Dakota study that was done that when you're around 0.5 or so, if you average these all out, they're going to be somewhere around 100% of what your natural unimpeded yields are going to be. But as soon as you hit an EC of 1 or so, it really starts going down. So once you hit 1.5, you're only about 80% of potential yield. And if you get up to 2, you're down less than 2/3 of potential yield, and it just goes downhill from there. It just crashes after that. So there's also additional stresses. The salts is additional stress. The cover crops will help to reduce that stress by taking up water and taking up nitrate. Here's with and without oats. You could use barley. You could use last year's winter rye that's coming up. And then ortho EDDHA is the right iron fertilizer to use. So this is the summary slide. There's no N required. Inoculation only when years are separated widely or first year. And then the critical value of P is 7 ppm on the chart, and maybe 6 ppm this year. Don't put any fertilizer with the seed except for iron. And then potassium needs to be related to clay chemistry, offer charge, manage IDC with a multi-prong approach, monitor the soil pH so it doesn't drop below 5.7, sample by zone to make sure that's happening, and sulfur is probably not going to be an issue for you this year. Here's our circular, there's my information.